Hi, everyone. Welcome to our ninth webinar in this series of 11 webinars. My name is Andres Sibbles, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator today. So on behalf of the USDA Climate Hubs and the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network, I'd like to welcome you to the ninth presentation, again in this series of 11 webinars. As you know, the focus of the series is grazing land management and soil carbon. And our goal is to provide an update on the knowns and unknowns about the influence of management on soil carbon dynamics in grazing lands of the continental United States. Today's presentation will be followed by a short question and answer session. And so we're asking that you please type your questions for the speaker at any time during the presentation, but please use the Q&A tool in Zoom. We ask that you do not use the chat tool. It complicates our ability to keep track and address your questions appropriately. So again, please use the Q&A tool. And today's webinar will conclude promptly at 45 minutes past the hour. The title of today's presentation is Long-Term Carbon Responses to Grazing and Brush Management in a Semi-Arid Arizona Rangeland. And today's speaker is Dr. Heather Throop, an ecosystem scientist and professor at Arizona State University. Dr. Throop's research and teaching interests focus on carbon cycling in dry rangelands. After receiving a doctorate from Stony Brook University, Dr. Throop moved to University of Arizona for a postdoctoral fellowship and quickly became intrigued by deserts. She has held faculty positions at Beloit College and New Mexico State University, served as a Fulbright Research and Teaching Fellow at Namibia University of Science and Technology, and served as a Program Officer at the National Science Foundation. Dr. Throop is currently a professor at Arizona State University, where she is jointly appointed in the School of Earth and Space Exploration and the School of Life Sciences. So with this, we will now listen to Dr. Throop's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share with you some work that I and some of my collaborators have been doing. And this particular work we'll talk about today is focusing on land management impacts on carbon pools in Western drylands. My work broadly focuses on carbon cycling in arid, semi-arid, and hyper-arid lands throughout the world. I'll use the word drylands as a shorthand for these arid, semi-arid, and hyper-arid lands. So drylands are defined as locations where the aridity index is less than 0.65. For those of you who are working in music systems and aren't familiar with this term, this is the yearly water inputs from rain or snow, so mean annual precipitation, and that's then divided by the potential evapotranspiration in millimeters. So here's an example. I live near Phoenix, Arizona. The aridity index here is about 0.1, meaning the amount of rain that we get for us, just rain, no snow, how much that is about a tenth of that water that would evaporate, the potential evapotranspiration, if we had an open body of water such as this swimming pool, and if that was maintained full all the time. So to be classified as a dryland, annual evapotranspiration needs to be about twice as much as annual rainfall. So although we think of drylands often in society, they've been classified as desolate or often considered low value due to their water limited state. Drylands turn out to be really important for our global carbon cycle and for human society. So drylands cover more than 40%, so nearly half of the Earth's land surface. Their extensive land area leads them to account for about a third of the terrestrial photosynthesis and plant production and about 20% of global soil carbon. So these lands then account also then for substantial interannual variability in the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And from a human perspective, these lands are really important. They house a substantial and then disproportionately growing segment of the human population, but they're also home to the majority of the global livestock. And one of the dominant global land cover changes in drylands in the past 150 years has been woody encroachment. And this is an increase in trees and shrubs into grasslands and savannas, so systems that were historically grass dominated. This phenomenon has affected about 40% of the land area worldwide, and drylands have been particularly heavily affected. The stars in areas on the map here are areas where there's been reported woody encroachment, so it's not at all an exhaustive documentation. And we have a really major problem now in terms of we don't understand how the carbon and nutrient cycles are affected by this woody encroachment. And this is particularly magnified in drylands because we have a lot of uncertainty in carbon and nutrient cycling processes in drylands in general. And so with this major land cover change, we have a particularly large amount of uncertainty in what the consequences for woody encroachment will be in dry systems. So I'd like to take you today on a virtual trip to the Santa Rita Experimental Range. So this is in southern Arizona. It's down right on the transition between the upper Sonoran Desert and semi-desert grasslands. And there have been long-term concerns here about decreasing grass productivity and hence the potential for decreasing livestock production. And this led to a really early establishment of research in Arizona. So in 1902, the Santa Rita Experimental Range was established as the first experimental range in the country. And there have been changes in management and ownership over time, but all through this now, 120-year plus history, there have been dedicated scientists that have maintained amazing records of land management treatments. And this has really turned into a gold mine of careful records and data that we can mine now. The Santa Rita is currently managed by the University of Arizona, and it also serves as a long-term agricultural research site, and it's the core site for the Southwest Desert Domain of the National Science Foundation's National Ecological Observatory Network. So let's travel back in time to the year that the Santa Rita was founded. So if we looked at the Santa Rita in 1902, researchers could access their research areas by driving a horse-drawn cart through wide open grassland. By 1938, we see cholla cactus in the foreground here, right? And then back in the background, we see some mesquite shrubs are present. By 1971, we see more shrubs here in the background, as well as some up front. And by 2003, it's really hard to imagine driving a horse-drawn cart through this landscape. I honestly have a hard time just walking through this system and not getting cactus spines in my shoes and in my pants. It is important to note that this particular 2003 photo was during a kind of a low water year, bad grass year. There are still perennial grasses at this site. It's not a complete loss of grasses, as seems to be illustrated here. But we wondered, how is this very big change in vegetation influence carbon storage in the landscape? Woody encroachment has inspired quite a bit of research to understand how this major land cover change would impact carbon storage. But it's still been challenging to determine the net consequences of this change. What sorts of generalizations can we make? Now, the story does seem a little bit more straightforward if we look just at above ground carbon. So here, this is a synthesis that Nicole Barger and colleagues did. And if we look at here, the y-axis is change in ANPP, or the primary production, and the change in that primary production following encroachment. And so values greater than 0 have a net increase in production with woody encroachment. And we see that production is generally positive, and that there's a positive correlation with rainfall here on the x-axis. Now, this also holds in dryland areas, which I've highlighted in red. But this story becomes much less clear when we look below ground. So here, if we look on the y-axis, this is a change, the percent change in soil organic carbon following woody encroachment. And at first glance, the regression line seems to indicate that woody impact on soil carbon declines with rainfall. If we dig in a little bit deeper, we don't really see a very clear relationship. So if we look just at shrubs, so those are the solid diamonds here, we see that soil carbon change is generally positive, but there's really no relationship with rainfall. And if we look just at drylands, we see that there's just a huge amount of variability in soil carbon response to woody encroachment. So it can be really from 0 to 100%. So working with Steve Archer and Mitch McLaren originally at the Santa Rita Experimental Range, we started exploring how much of this inconsistency and lack of predictability we might be able to get a handle on if we tried to find something that was predictable through space and time. And so we thought, for example, that one thing that these studies often lack is a particularly standard methods for sampling, and maybe this would account for some of the variability. So we predicted that we would be able to increase our capacity to predict soil carbon if we formally considered the impact of shrub size. And we expected that very small shrubs, such as this one here, in the upper left, that this would have a much lower impact on soils than this large one down here, right? That's had a much larger time, more time, right? There's been more time for leaves and roots and other impacts for the plant to influence the soil. So we also expected that soil carbon would be greater towards the bowl or the center of the plant, right? So we'd have more soil carbon towards the center, and that would decrease as we went out towards the drip line and then into the herbaceous zone. And this would be due to the longer term impacts of the plant on this space relative to the drip line or the intercanopy herbaceous area. So we tested these ideas by collecting a large number of soil cores in a very spatially detailed manner. So here we show soil carbon, so on the vertical axis, right? So we have the amount of soil carbon per area, and that's in response to differences in shrub size, which we show here as basal diameter. So small shrubs towards 0 and very large shrubs towards 100. And then we also looked at the function of the location under the shrub, so whether we were coring towards the bowl or towards the drip line. So lower numbers here, right, are towards the bowl, and higher numbers towards the drip line. And from this data, we can then construct a 3D model, or this 3D surface that's really composed of a family of curves for shrubs of different sizes. We can then predict carbon for a shrub of any given basal diameter by selecting the curve at that location. So you can think of that as a slice through this cube. And then we rotate that curve and integrate as the volume of a solid revolution. And that tells us how much carbon is present underneath a shrub of any given size. So this yields then this spatial model of soil carbon for the shrub. And we have the subcanopy soil carbon here, right on the top. And that's shown here as really sitting on top of this background soil carbon that is the carbon that would be there regardless of the vegetation. And we can see here again towards the center, and then the model goes out to the drip line of the canopy. So this returns predictions of soil carbon for shrubs of different sizes, such as the small, medium, and large example shrubs that are pictured here again. We affectionately call this the Hershey's Kiss model of soil carbon because of the pattern of it, of that volume. But we can use this modeled carbon then to illustrate a few things, right? We can improve the predictability of woody encroachment and how the impacts of woody encroachment are on soil carbon if we carefully account for shrub size and spatial patterns. And we've done a lot of playing around with the data and looking at the implications of what predictions we would get if we didn't take those spatial patterns into account, and they're very different. We know that the data are very clear that at the Santa Rita, then shrubs enhance soil carbon. But this is really something that we only see with the larger shrubs, right? They have to get to be a particular size to have a substantial impact on soil carbon. For any given shrub, there's a really strong subcanopy spatial pattern. These develop with time, and there's more soil carbon towards the center of the shrubs with most impact on these very large shrubs. And we followed up with detailed analyses of the chemistry and stability of this carbon that accumulates from shrubs. In short, enhanced soil carbon at this site is derived primarily from shrub inputs, and in particular of the shrub inputs, then leaf inputs appear to play a much larger role in soil carbon than do roots from this shrubs in this particular system. But we recognize that woody encroachment does not occur in a vacuum. Most woody encroached drylands are also grazing lands. This is definitely true of the Santa Rita. But the Santa Rita has facilitated exploration of grazing impacts, as there are also fenced areas that have been protected from grazing, and some of these have now been protected for more than 100 years. Despite this very long-term protection from grazing, we found no difference in the spatial patterns of soil carbon with shrub size and subcanopy location for grazed shrubs versus those in the areas where protection from grazing had occurred for about 100 years. Woody encroachment has impacted grazed lands in the western U.S. for more than a century, and this has led to many creative efforts to reduce shrub cover with an effort to increase livestock grazing in these systems. So as I'm sure many of you are aware from a management perspective, right, brush management is now and has historically been a really prominent tool in managing grazing lands, particularly important in these western drylands. So the Santa Rita again provides a really unique research lab as brush management techniques have been trialed and documented at this site for the past century. And there's some additional unique features at the Santa Rita in that there have been these extensive brush removal treatments. Particularly the 1960s seemed to be a real hot time for aerial herbicide applications. And these, the aerial herbicide applications are fantastic because they left large numbers of standing mesquite skeletons. And then the dry climate of the Southwest leads to very slow decomposition of this standing wood. So we can still find these skeletons and assess the long-term impacts of brush management, how this has affected soil carbon pools decades after the treatments were applied. So here I show again these 3D surface models, but we're contrasting now the live shrub models in the top here, and on the top, relative to shrubs that were killed about 50 years prior to our sampling. And what we see here is that most of the carbon in the skeleton sites has degraded in these decades following shrub mortality. And we see that the subcanopy spatial patterns are really not present, right? We don't see, except for this, maybe a tiny influence on the very largest shrubs and right towards the center of the bowl. So we've also explored the combination of grazing and brush management on soil carbon. We've got these locations where you have all these possible interactions. And we find that in the presence of grazing, brush management causes soil that had accumulated from shrubs to degrade in a very similar way as it did in the absence of grazing. So at least over these multi-decade timescales, grazing really doesn't influence these trajectories of brush management impacts on soil carbon. And so we've used a similar approach in other systems. I'll show you one other quick example. This is from western juniper that has encroached into sagebrush steppe in eastern Oregon. And so here we've included several different carbon pools. I won't go into details on those pools, but the key thing here is that juniper has encroached into sagebrush. And when we see this encroachment, we look at juniper relative to sagebrush, right? We see an enhancement of all these pools above the background deep soil carbon pools that don't change. And so we can model different spatial scenarios of juniper cover. We've played around with how further expansion of juniper will increase storage in carbon pools. So if we go from the current juniper cover and we double that, we see again a further increase. Or if we say, well, what if 50% of the landscape was covered with juniper again? We see an increase in the total landscape carbon pools. At this site, we can also look at brush management in neighboring plots. So there was some manual cutting that took place several years prior to our measurements. And again, we find that carbon pools decline rapidly, although here we know, right, this is within a few years of our sampling. So collectively, these data show that woody encroachment can increase soil carbon storage. We can improve the predictability of these patterns by taking into account factors such as shrub size and subcanopy patterns. However, enhanced carbon from woody encroachment appears to be pretty transient. It will degrade pretty quickly following brush management. Natural mortality is likely to cause similar patterns. And in comparison to the strong impacts on soil carbon from woody encroachment and brush management, we found pretty limited impacts of grazing on soil carbon. And I think an important caveat here is that the stocking rates at the Santa Rita have declined with time, but they've all typically been lower than is frequently seen on southwestern grazing lands. So heavier stocking rates could have very different results. Drylands have undergone dramatic changes in vegetation, climate, and land management over the past 150 years. The results presented here are focused on a well-documented site in Arizona. It's unknown how these patterns will differ under site-specific changes such as plant species, soil type, management, history, and climate. I'm really eager to expand our understanding to other woody encroached drylands, and I look forward to learning from you about your knowledge in other systems. Thanks so much for your attention, and I will be happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. We have a number of questions that have come in, and so I will try to go through those and read them. And for those attending the webinar, please feel free to enter new questions, but remember to use the Q&A tool, please. Heather, the first question is whether are these encroaching plants natives that were there before European settlement, or was this land grassland for long before that time, is the first question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's an interesting pattern. So these are, at the Santa Rita, they are exclusively native species that were present. It's almost all velvet mesquite, Prosopis velutina. And that tends to be true also in other encroached systems. There are exceptions, but these are largely native species that have then become more dominant. The pattern at the Santa Rita is very much that the mesquite, we can see from these great historical photos, we can see that mesquite was present historically, but was largely restricted to drainages. And then over time, it has spread out more across the landscape.
There's a question about root depth of the mesquite. So the question goes, how do you account for the carbon contribution of the very deep-rooted species such as mesquite?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question that I wish I had a lot better answer for. It's tricky to get, we'd love to have much
greater depth samples. That's something we've struggled with over time. The mesquite is certainly has a lot of deep, or can get very deep in roots, but it also has a lot of surface roots. And so we have focused on the shallower roots in the top 20 centimeters or so primarily, and would love to have better numbers about how deep. The problem that, well, it's hard to just to get those deep values, and also they seem to get a lot more spatially variable, right? Because you have, as you go with depth, you have a few of these larger roots, and so trying to, I think you need trying to actually capture that pattern that is probably extremely spatially heterogeneous is going to be tricky, but really I think interesting and important.
Thank you, Heather. There's a somewhat related question about the depth of your soil organic carbon measurements at Santa Rita. This participant says, I am really surprised at how quickly the original grassland and 1960s shrub signal has disappeared, and is of the opinion that most soil organic carbon models would predict something different.
Yeah, so we, again, focus largely on those shallower depths. What I can say is we can see that, and not surprisingly, it's more dynamic the shallower you go. Yeah, so we have looked at kind of very shallow, like the top 5 centimeters, and top, then 5 to 10 and 10 to 20, and it becomes less dynamic. So I would expect that, as you go down, we don't have those spatial pattern data at greater depths. I would expect that it would become less dynamic over time. Yeah, we were surprised at how much loss there was as well after the shrub, the 1960s signal really did degrade a lot. We've have some evidence from in some of the papers that were cited there, that looking at the specific, like using some biomarkers to look at impacts, and we know that some of that the shrub derived carbon is still present after 60 years, right? We can still see some of the carbon-13 signal from those, but the overall, the percent carbon has basically gone back to background levels.
We have 2 questions about grazing here, Heather. The first is asking if you could share more about grazing management at Santa Rita. You mentioned low stocking rate. Is rotational grazing practice intensive or adaptive management? Have management strategies changed over the years? Is the question.
Yeah, good questions. I am not a grazing expert. Fortunately, there's a bunch of really fantastic people working specifically on grazing at the Santa Rita, and there is amazing histories of the stocking rates. They've really done just a fantastic job of keeping that data. What I can say is, so the Santa Rita, when it was set up in I think they were established in 1902. I think it was 1903. They put what was, my understanding is, was basically like the first big, fence in Arizona. So they fenced the Santa Rita, or the part of the area that is now the Santa Rita. So the Santa Rita has expanded a little bit over time, but they put a fence around, right? And had from, I think it was from 1903 to 1915 or approximately, there was no grazing there. So we have this time where there was no grazing. We know, though, that the landscape was already impacted from that grazing that happened. So this still is not a no, this isn't the impact of there being no grazing. It's just our ungrazed, or sort of our protected from grazing sites haven't been grazed since 1903. So since then, so when they put cattle back on, somewhere around 1915. But during the time that whole range was fenced off, then researchers established a series of different cattle exclosures, so that when they put animals back on, then it would still have these areas that were protected. So these are really special areas that haven't been grazed since 1903. I'm sure they've, some animals have gotten in now and then, but basically ungrazed areas, and there's some additional ones have been established over time. So since then, in the grazed areas, then there has been extensive research looking at trying out different management strategies since, and I'm hesitant to say very many specifics because I think I'll get them wrong, but the last several decades anyway, there has been, it's been primarily rotational grazing, and that the exact details of that scheme have changed over time. If we look at just the number of animals per area over time, that has decreased quite steadily over time, even when they started out and put animals back in there. This is really unique in terms of it was just it was a free-for-all outside of the range, but it's been a continual realization that even the stocking rates that were thought to be low enough to sustain grass production in the Santa Rita, it's been continually reassessed and continually decreased to try to lower the impact and maintain grasses. There is currently an adaptive management strategy, and there's a lot of data collection on utilization that's used to make decisions on moving animals around. And lots more information on the website of specific details of that I can't provide.
Thank you, Heather. We have another grazing question here regarding you. The question goes, you pointed out that there appears to be little effect of grazing on soil carbon at moderate and low stocking rates, even in the protected area of exclusion. Any experimental or observational evidence for the impacts of heavy grazing, either historical or contemporary?
Yeah, well, we know that the Santa Rita was quite heavily grazed, prior to the establishment of the range. But again, that's something that we don't have the data to know, because certainly in southern Arizona, to my knowledge, there are no areas that we know have never been grazed, right? So we don't have that ability to make those comparisons with those historical grazing data. We have a little bit of data. We've done some studies looking at biosphere effects, where we look at grazing near water points, and then moving further away from that. And there's some interesting patterns here. Another cool thing of the Santa Rita is that there are some strong climate gradients across the Santa Rita. It's along a alluvial fan, big differences in elevation and precipitation. And so we have different patterns of grazing impacts as we go, and shrub impacts on carbon as we go along that precipitation gradient. But still, these are relative to other areas of the Southwest. These are, I wouldn't consider these very heavily grazed areas. There's certainly a lot of other sites that have heavier grazing.
Thank you. There's a question here about asking what the 120-year trajectory of annual precipitation has been.
Great question. I don't have that off the top of my head. There has been, we have a good record from the Santa Rita. It does not go back 120 years, but there has been rainfall collected. It's super variable in space. And I think the recent data I've seen is increasing variability in time. It's we're monsoonal system, so we have about half of the rainfall in these summer monsoon rains and half in the winter rains. I don't have the data off the top of my head to tell you how that has changed over the last 120 years. But fortunately, this is one of the few sites that we do have the possibility to get the data. The Southwest, and particularly within the US, we have pretty limited long-term climate data, limited stations that have really good data compared to some other areas.
Thank you. There's another question here about shrub versus background carbon, and it goes, could you describe how to tell the difference between shrub carbon and background carbon?
Yeah, so what we have classified that as so we see these really strong gradients in carbon. If we look under shrubs, we see this decline from the center of the shrub out to the drip line. And then we've continued coring, moving out from the drip line. We find with it at the Santa Rita that by the time we get to the edge of the drip line, it's pretty similar to this sort of inner canopy area outside of the shrubs. And so we have considered this background carbon just the average of what we find outside of canopies, away from shrubs, and we'll often go try to get a point that's as far as from any of the neighboring shrubs as possible to try to make sure that we're outside of that impact. There's dryland systems tend to be really spatially variable, and so that's certainly true in our soil carbon values. That we can get an average value, but there's still a lot of variability from core to core and what those are.
Thanks. There's a question about prescribed burns here, and it goes, has there been brush management through controlled burns? And if so, how might you expect the soil carbon changes in comparison to the other brush removal strategies presented?
Yeah, that's interesting. Many of these areas, so currently, prescribed burns are not typically effective at removing shrubs. And the grass density, I'm looking at our backgrounds here, this beautiful lush grassland. And these are systems where, if you can imagine, I think back to the last photo in this series of the woody encroachment series that I showed with no grass there. That was a bad year. Typical years there would be a little bit more grass. A sort of good year we might have 30% grass cover. So the fire does not typically carry very well, and which is one of the ideas of the drivers of shrub encroachment in this particular system. It is that this combination of grazing and fire suppression, right, has influenced the ability of shrubs to establish, because there's just so little cover. And so maybe if we had less grazing and we had more grass, one idea is that fires would be more effective at preventing shrub establishment. What we know is that once mesquite get very large, and well, maybe 5 years old or so, that even if a fire, if there is a fire, it's unlikely to kill the plant. So these plants are incredibly effective at resprouting, which means that prescribed fires are just not very effective at certainly at long-term removal. Potentially they can knock them back for a few years. We certainly do have some sites at the Santa Rita where there's been some not prescribed burns, but some unintentional burns, and we have some evidence there of mesquite that have been at least reduced in size as a result of those fires.
Thanks. There is a question about woody plant versus grass dominance. And so following woody species removal, how long does it take in arid or semi-arid regions for grass species to establish? And what is known about carbon pools above, below ground from the time period following woody species removal to grass species establishment?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is that many of these areas, the grass species establishment is certainly not guaranteed following woody removal. And so, and I think, one of the big challenges is the variability of precipitation, right? So if you happen to be lucky and have some woody plant treatment and canopy removal just before a good monsoon year, and then with also some good winter rains, then there's a pretty high likelihood of grass establishment. The probability of that is, of those all aligning is fairly low, and so, and then it depends on the system, but we often do not get that good grass establishment, and so I don't know of studies in the Southwest where there have been clear data showing, how the soil carbon trajectories have changed, in that rare case where you have good grass establishment, right? Has anybody been able to then document changes in soil carbon? I'm not sure if I think that there were two parts of that question. I'm not sure that I got both of them.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I think you perhaps did, and we'd like to remind our participants that if we don't get around to answering all the questions today, we'll try to post some of those answers on our website eventually, so you can go back and visit and see them there. And we might have time, Heather, for one more question, if you would. And this is a question about the relationship between shrub density and soil carbon found. I'm wondering what happens to soil carbon beyond the shrub cover, and was soil carbon measured as total carbon or organic carbon? So one has the two parts to the question: density, and then what fractions of carbon were measured. Yeah.
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, it's does carbon change beyond sort of the edge of a canopy? Is that
that's what it appears to say. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the Santa Rita, we find with mesquite that it really is kind of towards the edge of the canopy. By that point, then those soil carbon levels are equivalent to outside of the canopy, and it's really in that the middle third of the canopy that by far there's much more soil carbon that accumulates. And we measure this as soil organic carbon, so we remove the inorganic carbon. At the Santa Rita, the soils we work on, there is not much inorganic carbon, almost none, but we still treat the soils to remove any inorganics, to make sure that, right, this is carbon that is directly being impacted by plant inputs.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for the presentation and for your answers to the questions. We have running out of time, unfortunately, so we're going to have to wrap this up. And so again, I want to thank you all for attending this session of the Grazing Land Management and Soil Carbon webinar series. And please note, and I think Susan mentioned this in the chat, that a link with a recording of today's presentation will be available on our webpage. And so we'd ask that you please plan to join us for the next webinar on December the 2nd. And the title of that talk will be Soil Carbon Responses to Grazing Land Management in the Northern Plains by Dr. Mark Liebig. And so we hope to see you then. You will see that the survey popped up on your screen. If you have time before you jump off, we'd ask that you please complete the survey. Thanks a lot, and we hope to see you on December 2nd.